Remembering a prince of thriller writers now on BBC4 and his recently discovered take on the post-war years that we've been exploring in the Lost Decades season. Dennis Wheatley, A Letter to Posterity.
For 4 decades, Dennis Wheatley was second only to Agatha Christie as Britain's best-selling author. But this wasn't murder in the vicarage. This was international intrigue in the manor house and devil worship in the crypt.
He is the most important British occult writer since Bram Stoker's Dracula.
His most enduring story, The Devil Rides Out, served a post-First World War surge of interest in spiritualism and the occult.
That is the book.
It's the greatest occult novel of the 20th century.
But a little-known discovery in the ruins of his former country mansion adds another, darker chapter to the already remarkable story of Wheatley's life.
The coming of the machine age enabled the politicians of the all men are equal school to get into ever closer touch with the masses. All men are not equal. Fight for your right to live, work and love how and where you will. If need be, die for it.
This was Wheatley's manifesto, written amid the grim aftermath of the Second World War, for throwing off the shackles of socialism and returning Britain into the hands of a ruling elite. Almost 30 years after his death, Wheatley's ominously phrased Letter to Posterity reminds us that the seismic social changes brought about by the war and entrenched by the Labour government were not just an affront to the ruling class's long-cherished values. They were the thin end of a blood-red wedge. Revealed here in detail for the first time, the letter sheds new light on what lies beneath the surface of Wheatley's popular adventure stories. In a scene reminiscent of one of his books, friends, historians, publishers and critics gather to reassess this best of sellers.
The plight of the monarchy is part of a broader problem that he identifies, which is the destruction of the old order.
The Soviet Union at that time was expansionist, aggressive, interventionist, an extraordinary kind of howl of pain, really, isn't it?
It is interesting that after the war, fascism did come back into Britain very rapidly. Communists were fighting fascists almost immediately on the streets.
There had been what, I'm sure to Dennis and to many of us, would have seemed an enormous betrayal. Churchill, having saved the country, is then thrown out in a subsequent election.
He advocates meeting in secret societies to cook up a coup or a plot, rather than advocating, open, lively discussion.
It's a fantasy of pure mind, which is the common denominator between far-right ideology and occult philosophy.
It was definitely a powerful mix, I think, of a political aim with some sort of mystical brotherhood or secret society.
Black magic is invoking occult forces to give you some sort of personal help.
In several of your books, you say that the devil is now operating through communism, that the devil is the communist states. Do you see
I believe that to be so. Oh, entirely so. Because you see, it's the disruption of family and all the kind of better things in life. This business where you have no free will, no freedom, and as I say, the destruction of the family particularly is a bad thing, an evil thing.
Britain, 1947. The lowest ebb. The Great Victory is a distant memory. Instead, a series of crises, financial, imperial, even meteorological, have combined to bring the country to its knees. Conditions are harsher than at any time during the war.
England today. England caught in the cold grip of economic crisis. The sea, frozen for the first time since 1929, is symbolic of England's ever-present gloom. One observer has charged that without vast changes, the crisis may become a steady slide into conditions of poverty unknown in the Western world in modern times.
If you wanted evidence that Britain was going to the dogs, you could find plenty of it in 1947. I mean, the year starts with a terrible winter. Between the 11th and the 22nd of February, the temperature in London never rises above freezing. Coal boats are frozen in the Thames. The trains can't transport fuel. There's a fuel crisis, there's an electricity shortage, factories have to be closed down, unemployment soars for a brief period. Wartime rationing actually gets worse in the early years of the Wheatley government, partly because Britain now also has to feed its occupied zone in Germany, which costs about £80 million a year.
I ask from you all the support that we shall need to carry us through triumphantly through difficult years to the great era.
The radical reform by Clement Attlee's Labour Party had won them a landslide victory even before the war was over, and left the country's wartime leader in the wilderness once more.
I'm sure to Dennis and to many of us would have seemed an enormous betrayal. Churchill, having saved the country, is then thrown out in a subsequent election, largely due to the evil left-wing educational establishment in the army.
Indeed.
So there was a very real tension of that sort.
It was William Beveridge's famous wartime report into social insurance and the slaying of the 5 giant evils he identified, which was setting the agenda.
The common people everywhere, in and out of the forces, want to know what is going to happen to them when peace comes. Want must not be known again, as in the trade collapse after the last war. Idleness. There must be no mass unemployment, the giant evil of only yesterday. Ignorance, says Sir William, no democracy can nowadays afford. Post-war children must have far better educational facilities than they have now. Disease. The evil of disease must be overthrown. The voluntary hospital and the expensive nursing home are not enough to maintain this nation in good health. Squalor. We are not fighting to preserve slums, which breed our own diseases just as swamps breed malaria. No more generations must be stunted in squalor.
The new welfare state, protection from cradle to grave, was the promise held out to a people wearied by war. But to Wheatley, this was a charter for the feckless and the idle that would weaken the sinews of the nation. If not checked, it would lead inexorably to communism, of whose baleful influence his fiction had already given notice. The Britain that he had served in 2 world wars, the empire that he had celebrated in his books, was losing its very soul. On the day of the young Princess Elizabeth's wedding, the 20th of November, 1947, Wheatley ignored the pomp and the circumstance and sat down to set out his vision.
I am now of an age with the King, having been born while the reign of Queen Victoria still had 3 years to run. At that time, even the thought that one day the British monarchy might be abolished was inconceivable. But in the 50 years of my life, greater changes have been wrought in the habits and mentality of the world's population than in any 500 years of previously recorded history. The coming of the machine age enabled the politicians of the all men are equal school to get into ever closer touch with the masses. Under the banners of liberation, they preached against every form of privilege, thus making the masses discontented with their lot. And later, as socialists, they openly advocated equality in all things. All men are not equal. Some have imagination and abilities far above others. It is their province and their right to take upon themselves the responsibility of leading and protecting the less gifted.
I have the document here. It is a letter that Dennis Wheatley wrote on the 20th of November 1947 and promptly buried, leaving it, he believed, for later generations who by that stage would be enslaved and totalitarianism and socialism.
And this is the slippery slope to which the new socialist government of the people, by the people, for the people, has now brought a once rich and prosperous Britain.
But the plight of the monarchy is part of a broader problem that he identifies, which is the destruction of the old order by the forces of the state, the forces of totalitarianism, the forces of socialism, that are undermining Britain's aristocracy, either aristocracy of blood or aristocracy of ability, and at one point he says weakening the race.
Therefore, if when this document is discovered, the people of Britain are bound to a state machine, my message to posterity is rebel.
Wheatley intended his letter for future generations and buried it in an urn on the terrace of his Georgian mansion in Hampshire. But now that it has come to light, it reveals the forces that drove him to write it, and also reveals what lies beneath the surface of the novels. His tales of fast-moving adventures, square-jawed heroes and spirited heroines in glamorous locations seem straightforward. But the vein of demonic possession and satanic ritual which runs through them tell a different story.
To this agonizing cacophony of sound, the dancer, still masked, quite naked, and utterly silent but for the swift movement of their feet, continued their wild, untimed gyration. The whole party flung themselves panting and exhausted upon the ground, while the huge goat rattled and clacked its monstrous cloven hoofs.
Do you actually believe yourself that you can call up the devil and all his works?
Yes, I do indeed. Oh, indeed I believe. I have no doubt at all. But I do think that it's a very rare thing, because it's a thing that needs enormous study.
Wheatley only wrote a handful of black magic novels, but those are still the titles for which he is best remembered. It may not have been a pact with the devil, but it certainly seemed like a cosy arrangement.
After looking straight into his eyes for a moment, the great ram replied, "I can see that you have had an interesting life. So I bestow upon you the gift of writing. Write a book based upon your own experiences. Abaddon will arrange that it shall be made into a film. Its rights will bring you several £1,000.
I think Dennis Wheatley holds a mirror up to the occult world of his time. In lots of ways, the details of the book, they do reflect something that is really going on at the time. There has been this occult revival that started in about 1875 or whatever, and has continued growing and growing up until the current day. And certainly in his day, there was actually an occult community. There were groups of magicians around that he knew of. So in that sense, you can say there's definitely an element of truth.
For the background of my black magic books, I've got most of my stuff from reading, but also in the 1930s, I managed to get introductions to the famous occultists of the day, people like Aleister Crowley.
Known as the Beast, Crowley was a notorious cult leader in the early part of the 20th century, proclaiming himself the most evil man in Britain. It is a measure of Wheatley's commitment to his research that he should seek him out.
Wheatley was a friend of Tom Dryburgh, the politician. Now, Tom Dryburgh, when he was young, had been a disciple, quite a grovelling disciple of Aleister Crowley. Through Tom Dryburgh, Wheatley was introduced to Crowley, who was a fairly pathetic figure by 1934.
I dig introductions to Crowley and to Rollo Armid, to Montague Summers and all these boys. Yeah. Had them to dinner, filled them up with old brandy and picked their brains. And I knew Crowley in that way. He could assume power over people. He could manipulate things in a way that would bring him money. He could make people weak and ill. All sorts of things that he wanted to do, he could do.
Crowley's classic novel Moonchild is very, very like Wheatley's own novel The Devil Rides Out. The sort of the characters, the kind of secret societies. Wheatley was able to nick that idea, really, and sort of turn it into something a bit more popular, twist it a little bit, take some of the ideas. I mean, there are quotes lifted wholesale out of Crowley's Moonchild in that book.
One of the other officiating priests at the infirmary produced some round, white discs, which Rex recognized at once as communion wafers, evidently stolen from the church. In numbed horror, he watched the devil's acolytes break these into pieces and throw them into the brimming chalice, then stir the mixture with a broken crucifix and hand the resulting compound to the goat, who, clasping it between its great cloven hoofs, suddenly tipped it up so that the whole contents were spilled upon the ground.
So vivid were Wheatley's descriptions of occult practices that some came to believe he was closer to the black arts than he would ever admit.
There's a tradition amongst the community now that he was actually a member of a coven or a magical group of some sort. He may have been a member of a group, perhaps Crowley's group, or a group like it. And there are at least two remarkable accounts of rituals that Dennis Wheatley was actually present at, and that both rituals play an incredibly big part. In fact, they form the nucleus of all the ritual activity that you find in his occult novels.
I must tell you one thing, that I have never attended an occult ceremony in my life because I regard it as definitely dangerous to get mixed up in that sort of thing.
He would be amused, but not altogether gratified, to think that he was considered to be preoccupied with supernatural stories. He'd hit on a successful vein in the 30s. It was his most successful book, I suppose.
And he stuck with it.
And from time to time, he brought it back again. And I think he's probably, I'm sure he believed in reincarnation. He probably believed in the possibility of supernatural events. Why wouldn't one? But it was a very minor part of his oeuvre.
I must say, in all fairness to Crowley, he never attempted in any way to induce me to join a coven or do anything I wouldn't want to do.
Wheatley wasn't quite as deeply into the occult as his popular image might suggest. I think he thought it would sell books. He wasn't very impressed by the occultists he met when he was researching the books, because they always tried to tap him for money. They're always either trying to borrow a fiver or sell him something, and he wasn't at all impressed by that. One of the things he says is, see, the trouble with these occult people is they never have any money. And of course, we've all noticed that. If you meet occultists, most of them don't. So he was very ambivalent. I mean, there must have been something about the atmosphere of occultism that he loved, partly, of course, because he associated it with sex. The whole thing of the devil in Wheatley is strongly associated with sexuality, and the idea of rituals is building in Wheatley's mind towards something sexual. There's always an atmosphere of something kinky about to happen, generally has to be stopped from happening, but they're deeply sort of salacious.
95% of this business now, there's nothing to it. It's simply wicked people getting together, youngsters, for obscene orgies and for pushing dope. Dope has always been mixed up with Satanism and witchcraft from the very beginning, from the earliest times, and that sort of thing. But it's nothing to do with the occult at all. They couldn't harm a rabbit.
There is something about Wheatley. Wheatley's stories, I think, they use the occult, but they're essentially adventure romance thrillers. The heart of them is an adventure in which a bunch of chums sort something out.
But let's go back to the beginning. This is the house in which I entered this wicked world. It doesn't look as though I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, does it? But it was a jolly good silver-plated one.
Dennis Wheatley was the only son of a family of Streatham grocers. From the moment he was born in 1897, he enjoyed lavish attention from his mother, but came to dislike his strict father.
Wheatley wasn't a gentleman. He was always acutely conscious of that. He'd have loved to be a proper gentleman. And so Wheatley's childhood was basically suburban. And he knew he was a boy from Streatham. I mean, had a lifelong sense of being a boy from Streatham.
To begin transforming him into a gentleman, Wheatley was sent away to boarding school at the age of 8. Unhappy and lonely, it was the scene of his first supernatural experience.
I went up to bed, and next to the landing, I suddenly looked through the banisters and I saw a most awful face looking at me. And so I gave one scream, and the headmaster and other people came out with hockey sticks and God knows what. And of course I was put to bed and comforted and given cake and lemonade and so on.
He was not a scholar. Instead, to escape the rigours of school life, he retreated into adventure stories.
I detested that place. By that time I discovered Dumas, and reading was my fun. In the third term I ran away. And from the papers in my desk it was discovered that I'd been running a secret society. And so I was expelled.
When war came, Wheatley had finished his schooling in the naval training ship HMS Worcester, but he secured a commission in the London Royal Field Artillery, seeing action at Cambrai, St Quentin and Passchendaele before being caught in a gas attack.
Luckily, I wasn't killed or wounded. The thing that got me down worst was spending 3 or 4 hours every day for over 1,000 days watching my men water, feed and groom horses. And I've never really cared much for horses. I much prefer girls.
The war brought him into contact with a man who would have a profound but less than healthy influence on the impressionable young officer. Even he described his new and intimate friend as immoral and a crook of the very first order. But for the next 10 years, they became inseparable.
The single biggest influence on Wheatley's life was a man called Eric Gordon Toome. Now, they'd been army officers together in the First World War. He was unfortunately a gentleman criminal and fraudster, and they had a very fast life together in the early 20s.
By day, Wheatley was a respectable Mayfair wine merchant. By night, like many others who had survived the trenches, he plunged headlong into what was to become the Roaring Twenties.
He met Eric Gordon Toome, who was a very evil influence, in fact, and they did various things together, misbehaved in all sorts of ways.
Among Toome's post-war rackets was charging the government for munitions that had never been made by companies that didn't exist. Despite this, Wheatley worshipped his charismatic friend, even commissioning an etching for a bookplate featuring the pair of them to paste into each new volume of his growing library.
He puts this guy on a pedestal as personified as Pan, with the goddess in the background. As the kind of...
It's a sort of hangover of 1890s kind of decadent paganism and the whole Pan thing of the period,
We get the impression he lived fairly high on the hog in the 20s.
Yeah, they did a lot of sort of four-in-a-bed sort of stuff at a certain period.
So were they lovers?
No, they didn't have anything going between them. I mean, apart from...
A sort of very intense...
Platonic. Wheatley was sort of besotted by Toome. Yeah. And Wheatley, although he was bright, he was a great reader, but he just read things like historical fiction for boys. He read The Scarlet Pimpernel and The Three Musketeers and all that kind of stuff. And Toome really took Wheatley under his arm, and he got him reading everything: Oscar Wilde, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, the Quran, everything. And in fact, he was always very solicitous to Wheatley. And he'd write to Wheatley, he'd say, "Dear boy, I do hope you're persevering with your reading. It's so important."
Wheatley would do almost anything for his mentor. But when it all went wrong, Gordon Toome nearly took Wheatley down with him.
Although Wheatley says in his autobiography that he didn't know about the criminal career until Toome was dead, in fact he knew everything about it, and he was to some extent helping with it. The night that Toome burnt down a racing stables for the insurance money, it was Wheatley who was providing the alibi. He was in Toome's flat with 2 women, and of course the alibi was that Toome was supposed to be there as well.
When his shady deals caught up with Gordon Toome, it was headline news. Worthy of the Wheatley thrillers to come, the affair was shrouded in mystery.
He was in partnership with an Australian chap, and he disappeared. And my father was involved in where he'd gone to try and find him. He had in fact been murdered and was put into a cesspit.
Somehow, Wheatley walked away untouched from the scandal and into the arms of shoeshine heiress Nancy Robinson, whom he married in 1921. If the 20s represented decadence and indulgence for Wheatley, he was one of the lucky ones. A land fit for heroes had been promised. But by 1926, the reality was the general strike. Despite the social unrest and the breakup of his marriage, the pleasure-seeking wine merchant carried on regardless.
I was again in serious trouble. On top of the expenses of moving, our recent holiday, and a threat from the landlord to sue me for 2 quarters' rent,
I had earlier that year acquired a beautiful mistress. Somehow, I managed to stave off my creditors through the last months of 1926 and the spring of 1927. Then I was unexpectedly saved. On the 4th of May, my father died.
So he inherited the company, but even so...
And he wrested it from the hands of his mother. He had to go around to the nursing home where his father was dying and get him to sign something at the very last minute to make sure his mother didn't get it.
It's curious how many books have people signing things at the last minute, isn't it? Every book has someone signing things at the last minute.
Having got his hands on the business, Wheatley briefly flourished, showing some flair for marketing and promotion. But the crash of 1929 ended all that, and he was forced to sell out. By 1931, remarried and back in debt, he was ready to try anything.
Of course, I had much more leisure, and my income had gone down. And so I thought, well, I'll write a book and perhaps make 50 quid. It'll help with cigarettes.
He'd actually always wanted, I think, to be a writer. He'd written a novel in the First World War that was never published, probably been lost.
What was that? Was that just because he admired, you know, the other stories, the Three Musketeers and so on, so much?
He was really steeped in he loved narrative. He loved a good story. I mean, even when he was at his prep school, he used to tell stories to the other boys. He'd make them up, like Three Musketeer-type stories. So he just loved narrative. And he liked the idea of what he thought was the writer's lifestyle. A big library and all that stuff. Very much the lifestyle, actually, that we now associate with Satanism, black magic, Wheatley-style Satanism.
And here it is. This was the first of 10 books about the Duc de Richelieu and his 3 friends, Simon Arden, Rex Van Ryn, and Richard Eaton. They have become known as those modern musketeers, and of course their characters were inspired by those of Alexandre Dumas.
Forbidden Territory introduces 4 of Wheatley's most enduring characters on a series of death-defying escapades, all set against the then exotic background of Lenin's Russia.
My friend, said the Duke seriously, have you noticed those little ventilators in your bedroom at the hotel? They are microphones, so that all you say may be overheard. In the restaurant, along the walls, there are microphones also. Russia is pleased to welcome the tourist or harmless businessman, but always the commissars are terrified of counter-revolution.
To do the promotion for his first book, he sold some furniture, because remember, he's doing it because he's bankrupt. So he doesn't have a lot of money to throw around for his first book.
He was very unhappy with his publisher, who he didn't feel was putting their backs into promoting his book, so he actually had printed a number of postcards that he sent out, and this is for the Forbidden Territory, and I think there were others afterwards. But essentially, this is exactly what happens now. This is what publishers do. I mean, I've got, you know, a stack of postcards on my desk, you know, sent from Penguin, Random House, HarperCollins, which are basically this, you know, an idea of the book and the author on the back.
So it's quite bold, really.
Yeah, he was also tremendously sensitive to his audience and what they wanted. He'd put questionnaires in the end of his books, asking if his audience would like more of this sort of book, or would they like to see a different sort of book? Did they like black magic? Was there too much research? Would they like that kind of thing? What would you like to see Gregory Salas do next? That kind of thing.
Cultivated reviewers as well, Anthony, as a reviewer yourself.
Assiduously, yes. I mean, and I don't think he even met Dennis when he first wrote to me, because I'd reviewed some book of his, saying what a jolly good review of this, what brilliant piece of reviewing this is.
Oh, so perspicacious you were.
Exactly. He was very good at that.
Yeah. And he was an overnight success. I mean,
completely.
Basically, there's no other way of describing it.
It was reprinted 7 times in 7 weeks. I became a bestseller overnight. I never looked back.
In the tradition of Rider Haggard and John Buchan, Wheatley's stories were a tonic for a Britain anxiously watching the storm clouds gather over Europe. In his world, decent chaps could be relied on to save the empire from Johnny Foreigner or the forces of darkness, and still have time for cocktails before dinner.
The great thing, as Dennis Wheatley's thrillers seemed to us at the time, when I was 12 years old or whatever I was, they seemed highly sophisticated. In a manner of speaking, they were highly sophisticated. He made the breakaway and started to use real places instead of talking about Harrods when you meant Harrods or Selfridges. He was prepared to say Harrods or Selfridges. And this process wasn't really completed until Ian Fleming did it. He's a halfway stage there.
For me, Wheatley creates a world that it's a child's world. It's essentially a children's world of corridors and locked rooms and planes and excitement and nice food and things to do. It's an adolescent world that adults want to go and play in of a certain age, I guess, and I guess I'm probably of a certain age.
And the sexual aspects of the novels, which are of course wildly innocent by modern standards, nevertheless seemed racy to us at the time.
That sort of sexual suggestion very much does appeal to young teenage boys, really, which is where most people start reading Dennis
And
Wheatley.
teenage girls.
I know too. Yes,
got
I
one
agree.
from the charity shop.
Thanks for all the lovely delight I found in your embrace.
You're a very wonderful man, Gregory. The most wonderful man. I did not think that there was anybody in the world quite as wonderful as you. I love you. He bent over her. The gods are being kind to me in my old age. Most beautiful women are either good, stupid, or vicious. And you're a marvelous exception. Lovely as a goddess, clever as an Athenian, and a bad hat like myself. Yet one who still has decent feelings. I'm going to kiss the lips off you once we land in France.
Nobody can pretend that Dennis actually wrote good prose. That would be going too far. Or good dialogue, not even sayable dialogue, probably. But he did write jolly good stories.
And he does write romantic novels. They're romantic novels for men.
Well, for women, the reason his readership was so massive, because women read them as well, because they always had a love story.
Yes, that's right.
They're quite naive. I mean, one of them ends, so Gregory and Erica lived happily ever after. I mean, very few novels for adults are going to end on that line. But Wheatley's novels were quite sort of tender-hearted. And his postbag, he got enormous fan mail from women.
The idea that women are willing.
They're spirited ladies, though, aren't they?
Yes, but they're spirited ladies who are willing, and he's one of the first people to actually introduce women who like sex.
He's always living vicariously through his characters.
Yes.
I sometimes get the sense, if you've read a lot of his books, there's always some sort of, sexual taking of somebody in there, and he is clearly obsessed with it. There's a lot of things that, are just beyond the pale in terms of the language that he uses and the way he describes certain parts of, the community.
I think it was of its time, the kind of racial stereotypes as well, the fact that all the people who practice magic are usually got some sort of disability, or they're sort of Indians who smell too much of curry, or they're all the sort of terrible cliches. None of that would wash now.
What would be seen now as racist or xenophobic did not trouble Wheatley's public. He consistently hit the top of the bestseller lists, and he enjoyed the fruits of his labour.
As an author, of course, I met lots of other authors. People like Aldous Huxley, Cronin, Franco, Michael Arlen, Howard Spring, lots of other lesser lights. And that's the reason that I got this lovely collection of, supposed to be one of the best in Britain, of autographed first editions. But a good half of my 4,000 booklet house are history, ancient religions, and occultism. Of course, for all these books of mine do require enormous research. Now look at that pile over there.
It's a story of him walking down Oxford Street reading a book.
Oh.
And he just crossed the road and all the traffic stopped. And he walked across still reading the book and going down. So he was always a tremendous reader.
Oh, yes.
Do you think there's a prescription for a bestseller? Do you think there's a formula for it?
No, I don't. Before I started to write my first book, I had always collected books. I had a lot of books. So I read Arnold Bennett, G.H. Wells, Joseph Conrad, the whole shooting match from Edgar Wallace up to Proust. And I found there was no resemblance between any two of those books. I had to do it myself, and I did it myself.
He always said books were 5% inspiration, 95% perspiration. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very lonely thing to do. He would read for 3 months. Then he would write for 3 months. And always 9 o'clock to, 1 o'clock. Then he'd have a little sleep, and then the afternoon, and then the evening after supper he would write.
I always write in pencil because I found it the easiest way in the long run, because one can rub out and correct as one goes. But if I typed, it would be quite terrible because my spelling's appalling and it hit me in the eye. And my grammar, if anything, is even worse. I couldn't tell you an adjective from an adverb if you paid me. But I can tell a story. Yes, I can tell a story.
One of his trademarks was to interweave those stories with meticulously researched real events.
He wrote these stories, which were fictional stories. His characters were always finding themselves in terrible situations. Some were Satanists, some were the Nazis, some were back to the period of the French Revolution, and so on and so forth. He built into these stories, which was very, very clever, real people, like in one of the Gregory Sallust books. Sallust has a very long conversation, entire chapter with Hermann Goering.
My name is Gregory Sallust. I am an ex-officer of the last war, now employed as a British Secret Service agent. You must know that by making such disclosures to me, you have signed your own death warrant. Yes, Excellency. Then why have you come here? Because I'm in love.
It's extraordinary. And you believe every word of it, because he did know what he was writing about.
Some of the critics have said that your style isn't so hot.
It isn't. By Jove, it isn't.
Is that a fact?
Oh, no. Oh, Lord, no. I think it may be better than it was, but it certainly never has been.
What makes you know that, Mr. Wheatley?
Well, because I'm told it.
But as you're writing it, do you not bother how you're putting it down, so long as the story is a good one?
Right. To make it plain to the reader what is going on. And I couldn't care less if it's grammatical or it's not grammatical, as long as it's perfectly clear to the reader. You see? And on that, I simply write. And if the highbrow critics don't like the way it's put, well, they can go and write better books, make more money.
No amount of literary style would have concealed the outlines of Wheatley's own political allegiances, evidence of which can be found in all his books.
His books were an attempt to influence the mass consciousness of Britain. He had his hand, behind the scenes as he saw it, definitely. There's a definite, the propaganda mission of his books is of a sort that you don't associate with novels. You associate it with people who own newspapers, and they can therefore fiddle with public opinion. But that was what Wheatley was doing in his books. Wheatley reveals that actually communism is the new face of Satanism.
Absolutely.
And that's tremendously topical for the politics of the time.
Unless we can checkmate them, they'll start dumping anarchists and agitators here by the hundred. All the scum whose full-time job it is to spread discontent and ruin. Then they'll send cargoes of illicit arms to their secret depots, and bombs and poison gas and every sort of foulness to desecrate England's green and pleasant land. For God's sake, man!
By 1939, the threat to Great Britain was not the communists, but the Nazis. Wheatley was again anxious to offer what skills he had in the service of his country.
Maxwell Knight, the MI5 agent runner, told him at the beginning of the war, when Wheatley tried to join MI5, Knight said, look, if you want to make a contribution to the war effort, write some more books.
Although he meant it much more lightly than perhaps Wheatley would have understood it. He meant give people something to read through the long nights and cheer them up. He didn't mean tell them what to think, which is actually the mission that Wheatley was on.
As it turned out, Wheatley was to play a much more significant role in the war effort. Through contacts of his wife, he was approached by a military intelligence officer for ideas on how to outwit the Germans if they were to invade.
The result was I sat down and I worked all night. And I wrote 5,000 words on resistance invasion. The paper went to the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, and the War Office.
And Wheatley was in at once at quite a high level because he was already the King's favourite novelist. Wheatley was the favourite novelist of King George VI. And so they got him in to think up all sorts of weird things. I mean, most of them quite picturesque and over the top. But he was at quite a high level, thinking up what to do about a German invasion, also imagining he was a German and saying how he would invade Britain, and that was quite valuable to them. Because one of the things they said, in fact, was, we've been playing this war like cricket, but Wheatley thinks like a Nazi. So that was why they valued his input particularly.
I said, well, is there anything else I can do? So he said, yes, go back and consider yourself to be the Nazi High Command and do us a paper upon how you would invade and conquer England. So I went to that, and in my library I had population maps and contour maps, and I worked for 2 days solid. A couple of magnums of champagne, or 3 magnums of champagne, and 200 or 300 cigarettes. And I did a 20,000-word paper on the invasion and conquest of Britain. And I'm afraid I was responsible for having all the names taken off the railway stations in case Nazi parachutists didn't know where they got to. And I had all the signposts turned around.
Within a year of the war starting, Wheatley had arrived just where he had always wanted to be, at the heart of the British establishment. The King liked his books, the Prime Minister liked his thinking, and he was working at the top secret nerve centre of Britain's war effort.
Strategic deception was one of the great success stories of the Second World War.
Wheatley was very big in that.
And Wheatley was a pioneer as early as 1940. Yeah. He joined an organisation called the London Controlling Section, which sounds like something from an occult novel. But actually in 1942 was very successful in helping to disguise preparations for Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, by persuading the Germans that there was a real threat of an invasion on the French coast at the time.
They decided to make a special section to do nothing else but deceive and mystify the enemy. And so I was brought in, the only civilian ever been commissioned directly as the Joint Planning Staff of the War Cabinet.
And of course, really the culmination of this were the D-Day landings, when the British very successfully persuaded the Germans through double agents that the main landings were just a decoy.
And of course we did all the stuff at Normandy, and we managed to get complete security, complete surprise when Monty landed on those beaches.
Once war began, his knowledge of the geopolitics of 1930s Europe left him well placed to work his characters, especially Special Agent Gregory Sallust, into stories based closely on wartime events.
Anyone who wanted to know what happened in the first 2 years of the war have only got to read The Scarlet Impostor, Fake Passport and The Black Baroness, and they will know. Yeah. It's very realistic. It was written as they were going on, a few months after the event.
Anthony, he was proud of his war record.
Oh, I think very. Of course, he liked that sort of thing. I mean only the operations that they masterminded, but the sort of service structure into which he had been brought. Except you remember his chief said to Dennis, "Oh, Dennis, wouldn't it be nice to get mud on our boots again?" Dennis said he could think of nothing he'd wanted less than to get mud on his boots again.
The man who sat down to write his letter to posterity on that November day in 1947 was 50 years old. He had fought through the misery of Flanders, left behind his beginnings in South London trade. In some 20 books so far, he had seen his fictional heroes fight off all kinds of evils. Now, an even greater evil threatened, the notion that all men are equal. It challenged everything he held most dear.
Having agitated for such reforms for so long, the all men are equal advocates were far from content and are now in the process of lightening the natural burden of the workers to a point where the wealthy and even the stability of the nation is threatened.
The state, which has become ever more intrusive during the war, to an unprecedented degree, continues to interfere in people's lives in the way that people like Wheatley find outrageous.
It's the fact, isn't it, that Wheatley thinks he's the last man on the barricades against this. And that's very interesting, because a large number of people at that point, of course, are thinking that.
I mean, there's no coincidence, for example, that Aleister Crowley's work is all about the will.